People have been looking for a number of years for something called the gay gene. There's thought that there might be a gene that might predispose some people to becoming gay, and there have been a number of studies produced to show that there has been some weak associations to genes. Now, you might think, well, that sounds pretty harmless, but just if you think about the implications of that, some people might think, well, I'm gay because my genes made me gay. Now, perhaps that might make them feel more at ease at who they are, more comfortable. But what happens if your son had the gay genes? Would you want to change that? Would you want to not have a son with gay gene? There are a lot of people from a certain coast in America who saw this as a way, if you could find the gay gene, then of course you could do prenatal testing and get rid of them. So there's a lot of, as soon as you bring up a topic like the gay gene, there are people that have quite opposing points of view that may be beneficial or damaging to discussions about the topic. A better example, I guess, is something that's happened a few months ago. ADHD, hyperactive children. I might have been one of those myself in hindsight. And so it's always been thought this is related to parenting, perhaps, or food, or too much television and stimulation. But they've actually found a gene variant that's associated with ADHD. That immediately was a very good, it was published in a really good journal called The Lancet, and the science was really good. However, as soon as it got interpreted by the public media, it was interpreted to say a gene caused ADHD. Now, the gene didn't cause ADHD, it was associated with the development of ADHD, and there's a huge difference between those two. There's no causality in a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about tonight. There is in the hard genetics, but not in the soft genetics. So that immediately raised a whole lot of issues. Did some parents, if your kid has got the genes for ADHD, you don't need to worry about any behavioural modification. They're going to be like it anyway. They're hardwired to be ADHD. So you don't need to discipline them. They're going to do that anyway. You don't need to stop giving them Fanta. So that was one conclusion that came from that work. And the other conclusion that came from that work is if they do have the gene for ADHD, then that's a medical condition. We should be treating them with drugs. We medicalise the problem, and the only solution is to drug them up. So I think there's a lot of bad information has come out from an interesting study, and that's a mixture of poor journalism and poor interpretation of the final results. We had in New Zealand something about the warrior gene a few years ago, and it's probably a topic that's not very safe to talk about because the last guy that talked about that was a geneticist. He had to leave New Zealand because he essentially was ostracised and lost all his funding. What he discovered was that there was a gene called monoamine oxidase that had been associated with increased violence. He found a variant that was slightly more common in the Maori and Pacific population than in European populations. The way he presented it probably wasn't the best, and it got him into a lot of hot water. And he was ostracised by the public and by his scientific community, probably for good reasons. It's not a topic that I would care to spend too much time on. However, I just want to point out that there's ongoing research in that. There's evidence that people in gangs in America have variants of the gene that make them more violent. And a judge in an Italian court a couple of years ago gave somebody a lesser sentence because he had one of these gene variants. Now, I thought he should have given him a longer sentence, if you think about it. So perhaps the genes made him do it. So that may be something that I hope that guy in Switzerland isn't reading the newspapers. So we have a lot of that sort of stuff going on, and it's all weak genetics. There's nothing causal about these gene variants that are being found. They increase your risk slightly. Now, the obesity gene is an example of some really good science. Now, I'm about 80 kilos. If I had every bad obesity gene in my DNA, I might be 85. But I don't know. I could have been 75. I might have all the bad genes. So what we've been able to find by all these studies, consistently what we find is that if you have the bad genes for obesity, you are about 4 or 5 kilos heavier. Not 40 or 50 kilos heavier, but only 4 or 5. So it only explains a tiny amount of the genetic component of any condition. So all of these genes are very, very weak. They're only explaining a small amount of risk. So some of the genes that have been identified for cancer risk, they're only explaining a tiny, tiny amount, and could largely be ignored because they're overwhelmed by environment and behaviour. Not so for the hard genes I talked about earlier, about inherited breast cancer and for some of the heart disease things. So there's a whole range in between, and we need to be aware of what we're talking about in different situations. Now, this has become a lot more complicated in the last few years because I can have my genes tested online. I can spit into a tube and have my DNA sent to America, and with about 6 weeks, the results come back online without me needing to talk to anybody with a medical background. So people are getting DNA results about heart disease and cancer and Crohn's disease, a whole lot of different risks, and they're talking about tiny, tiny increases of risks. But most of us don't understand what these risks are. And so this form of communication, I would suggest, is dangerous. I've just been involved in a little bit of a controversy it's over a month ago where they've been found a gene, the length of your telomeres is associated with when you're going to die. And so this gene test is being provided directly back to individuals without anybody to help them. So they're giving information saying, we think you're going to die when you're 65. But the tests are so poor, we don't actually know whether they're going to die when they're 45 or 95. It's a huge difference in the outcomes. What's more, the companies spend more time explaining about the products that will help you once they've diagnosed you to be an inferior person. You create the problem. A bit like male menopause. You create a problem and then you find a drug to treat it. So these companies had more information about what products you could take than what the test was actually trying to do. And do we really need that information? It might be interesting vaguely for me, but does my partner want to know that information? Does my boss want to know that information? Does my insurer want to know that information? Heaven forbid. So a lot of this information, you ask the question, do we really, really want to know this information? How valuable is it going to be? And when it is not even true to begin with, you see there's a lot of dodgy marketing going on. Now I just want to finish in the last couple of minutes by saying, well, there's the traditional genetics is really strong, really powerful. We've got the new stuff that's really weak, needs to be interpreted really carefully. We need to be really cautious about how it's applied, and preferably it should be done in conjunction with the health professional. Another part of my life is dealing with reproductive technologies, where people are infertile and want to have babies when they're 57, or lesbian couples want to have children. A whole lot of different situations. Whatever you can think of, somebody's already thought of it. And I just want to highlight that who's heard of something in the paper a couple of weeks ago called Google Baby? So it's a man in Israel. It didn't matter where he was, but he was in Israel. He decided he wanted to have a baby. So he emailed a fertility company in California. He arranged a sperm donor that he liked the look of and an egg donor that he liked the look of. And they got the sperm and egg out of the freezer, created some embryos by IVF, in vitro fertilization. They selected the best embryo, and they sent that to India to be implanted into the uterus of a surrogate mum in India. The mother was under a contract about what she could do. She wasn't allowed to smoke, wasn't allowed to drink during the pregnancy. The baby was born and then shipped to this gentleman in Israel, all done by email. And in New Zealand, I'm on a committee that stops anything like that happening, and because for about 10 different reasons why that would be illegal in New Zealand at the moment. But that's perhaps what we're going to see more and more in the future. As women, one of my jobs in the university is scare all the university students and tell them that their fertility, this peaks at about age 24, late 30s, you give up, 40s, it's hopeless. And what we're going to see more and more is women that are going to need intervention to help them have babies in the future. So the man was able to choose a very good-looking guy and a very good-looking woman, but when we come to the point where we think, well, let's just tinker a little bit with a few genes here and there. Perhaps we don't want them to have the infidelity gene. We don't want them to have the obesity genes. And if any of you that have seen Gattaca, it was a movie produced a few years ago, and it's got some scary implications for where we're at right at the moment. Written by somebody from Palmerston North, which is also interesting. So hopefully what I've done is just raised a whole lot of issues for you, that there is good genetics, and there is other genetics which is also good, but has the potential to be misinterpreted in the wrong hands. And perhaps as we move towards a future of a lot more assisted reproductive technologies, we need to make sure that we allow introduction of good genetics. We can do some types of assays at the moment that would prevent an abnormal child embryo being implanted into the mother. But where do we draw the line between what is good stuff and bad stuff? So hopefully we can talk about that soon. So hopefully I haven't talked too long, and we'll come back in a quarter of an hour.
Great.